Hey everyone, it's Scott Rustrolz here for the June 7th edition of the Listen and Learn podcast. As always, thank you for tuning in. Three big stories we want to focus on today, hopefully if we have time. The obvious big one is James Comey's impending testimony in front of Congress tomorrow. But we've got in the opening statement. Obviously, there'll be much more in question and answer tomorrow, but several key things I think that come out of the opening statement that I want to express that you're not seeing covered very much in most of the anti-Trump media, and hopefully are areas where they get questions from both members of the both sides of the aisle. So, first thing just is in his testimony, he says he met President Trump 9 times, and he only details 5 of those meetings. So, someone should ask what was discussed in those other 4 meetings. We have no idea. It could be good for the president, bad for the president, but it seems like a very logical question. Beyond that, in terms of the scope, I think some important things here. First, the really huge news is that Comey said that he did indeed tell President Trump 3 separate times that Trump was not under investigation himself. Why is this a big deal? First, Trump actually said that when he fired Comey, and immediately the media said that's not true. CNN, in fact, ran stories saying Comey would contradict that in his testimony, and instead he affirmed it, saying in January, February, and again in April that Trump was not under investigation, which I think puts a whole nother scope on this Russia collusion story. You've had the media and the Democrats say that there's tons of smoke here, but if there's so much smoke, how come the FBI has not even felt the need to open an investigation into the president himself? Now, this leads us up to the question of why did James Comey never say that Trump was not under investigation? We know from the testimony that Trump requested that Comey say so. So, there are a couple, the first reason that might come to someone's mind is that Comey does not want to comment about an investigation. However, Comey did publicly say that the Trump campaign was under investigation back in May, and he probably at that point could have clarified that Trump himself is not. And on top of that, some are saying, well, with the whole Clinton thing last year, maybe Comey's learned his lesson that it's not good to say you've opened investigation just have to later say you closed it, just to later say you had to open it again back in October. However, testifying in front of Congress under oath on May 3rd, Comey said on the Clinton email investigation, quote, "I think I've done the right thing at each turn," end quote, and that he had no regrets at all in terms of how he handled the Clinton investigation. So Comey is on the record saying he has no problem publicly announcing investigations have come to an end or they need to be reopened. So there's no reason why Comey could not have done that here. The 2 most logical reasons then why Comey would have decided not to to publicly say Trump was not under investigation was 1, to hurt the president because it's clearly put a cloud over his administration, or 2, to use this as leverage to say I'm his FBI director, knowing that if people thought the FBI was investigating Trump, it would be hard to fire Comey because people would assume that there was a bad reason for doing so, which is what has happened. So Trump would not want to lose that political capital, instead would keep Comey on. So Comey was essentially trying to exert political pressure on the president to keep him in by allowing this false perception that the president was under investigation to persist. And in that sense, it was Trump, not Trump, but it was James Comey who was politicizing the FBI and law enforcement. And Republicans and Democrats need to hammer him on that. Because the American people have a right to know whether or not their president is under investigation, and any false perception of that should be cleared up. And then if later down the road he were to be under investigation, then you say so. What else is important, I think, is noting is that, apparently, on the whole question of a loyalty pledge or Michael Flynn. Problem is you have you have no one in the room to corroborate what James Comey is saying. So you have a disgruntled former FBI director who we now have evidence was for political purposes trying to leverage Trump to stay in as FBI director, saying these various things were said. However, it's interesting to me that he kept notes of his meetings with Trump, but says he did not keep notes with his meetings of Obama. So that you have to ask whether or not there's an ulterior motive in place here, and again, the reliability of what he said, particularly because, again, testifying under oath on May 3rd, Comey said he'd, quote, never been told to stop an FBI investigation for political reasons. So for Comey to make any insinuation of a political interference by Trump into an FBI investigation would be he would need to rectify that with what he said under oath unless he was committing perjury. And in fact, he said that Trump said that if there were, quote, some satellite associates of his who did something wrong, it would be good to find this out. Not only did Trump not obstruct justice, he was there making quite clear he wants any justice to be brought to anyone who worked with the Russians. And I think as a sign of that is how confident Trump is that there was no collusion. So Democrats are going to focus a lot on this, what was said behind closed doors between two people. We don't know exactly what happened there, but we do know that Comey said to Congress he never felt any political pressure to end an investigation. He never alerted McCabe or the Senate Intelligence Committee chairs that there was something wrong going on. And today, in a separate hearing, you had Mike Rogers, the head of the NSA, Dan Coates, the director of national intelligence, saying that they never felt pressure to act inappropriately or illegally regarding the Russia investigation. So I leave this opening statement and I say there's a lot for Comey to answer here. Why was he keeping the facts from the American people that Trump was actually not under investigation? Was he the one politicizing an FBI investigation to try and preserve his job or exert negative political pressure on the White House? So we'll talk again tomorrow about what's actually said in the Q&A, but those are the big points that I think you have to take and are hopefully hammered home during the Q&A. Other two stories, quickly, very briefly, want to just say, the terrorist attack in Iran, 12 dead. It's a reminder that moderate Muslims are very often the victims of radical Islamic terrorists. But the other thing you have to say is the Iranian parliament, after being bombed, started chanting, "Death to America." And you have to say, really? You've just been attacked by radical Islamic terrorists and your reaction is to say, "Death to America"? It's absurd. And it's a reminder of how radical, anti-American, and dangerous the Iranian regime is. And it's a good thing that the president is building an anti-Iranian coalition in the Middle East, because that's a country that poses a long-term threat so long as it has a government like it currently has. And then finally, turning to the last story, we're going to follow up yesterday on immigration. If you remember yesterday, we discussed this chart here, which shows how, interestingly, for all the talk on how immigrants are boosting productivity because they're so much more productive than American workers, supposedly, you actually have a negative 0.5 correlation. So you can see in the blue line, productivity is essentially at an all-time low. And then the orange line is the inverted population share that is immigrants. And we are at a record high of immigrants, and yet productivity is at an all-time low. And then again, as a reminder on this chart here, you see that immigrants as a share of the population are at the highest levels since World War I. They have quintupled since 1970, and we've seen more than a doubling of the immigrants to nearly 45 million since 1990, during which time wages have essentially been flat. So you've had no household income growth in 18 years, and you keep taking on immigrants in a faster than ever pace, which has to make you wonder if that's putting a depressant effect on wages. And the reason I highlight this is because today we have news that the Trump administration is working on trying to tighten legal immigration, particularly these H-1B visas, which are supposed to bring in high-skilled workers into the country. But you have tremendous issues here where H-1B visas are only supposed to be allowed in if you cannot find an American to do the job. Unfortunately, you have a ton of loopholes. You've even had companies that have American employees who are high-performing, doing a good job here. They're all fired and then replaced with foreigners because you can pay them less. And you have to say, if you've got Americans who are already doing the job here, how could you possibly qualify for an H-1B visa whose requirement is you can't find an American to do the job? And this is just a backdoor way to cut wages, and it ends up hurting citizens' take-home pay. So the administration is looking on creating a new set of rules with the Justice Department today. They're going to make employers advertise online for jobs to Americans before they can use an H-1B visa. They must exclusively hire all U.S. workers first before they hire someone with an H-1B visa. And we're going to cut the cap and the duration of visas to limit the potential for abuse. And companies are going to have to report semi-annually on what H-1B visa holders are doing. I think this is a good step, and we need to have a real discussion here on what is the right level of legal immigration, and are we getting to a point where it's actually hurting existing citizens' take-home pay because a country needs to be run primarily for the needs of its citizens. So that's really the follow-up story for the day, but Please sure to tune in tomorrow as we talk about James Comey's testimony. And as always, we appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel and share with your friends. Thanks, everyone, and have a great night.